Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual Alumni Weekend celebration. This is the last of our live sessions this weekend, except for the class gatherings, of course. But if you missed any of the events, we do encourage you to visit hb.edu Alumni Weekend to watch all the recordings. It's been a full and fabulous weekend for our alums, and it's been really a great opportunity to reach people who we haven't reached before. So we looked at our registration list, and we had more than 20 alums who were joining us who have not attended a reunion in the past 15 years. So we're really excited about the reach this weekend. This session is the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at HB, how affinity group spaces affinity groups create spaces of inclusivity. And during this session, as I stated last night, a virtual event is no less important in marking the significant tradition of Alumni Weekend or reunions. And so one of the things that we try to do at Alumni Weekend each year is to dive a little bit deeper into a topic that's important to the HB community and to offer alums the opportunity to engage. And this one is no different. And it's really deep diving into affinity groups. So before I turn it over to Dr. Bassell and to Tony, I just want to let you know that we will be recording the first part of this session. So when Tony reviews the information and Tony and I go through the slides, we'll be recording that. We will not post or record the breakout session. So please know that the only part that will be recorded and posted as a part of the Alumni Weekend festivities will be this first part. We ask that you stay muted to reduce background noise for the recording. We do welcome you to use the chat features, to use the reactions, put your questions in there, and we'll address them as we go through. And then I do encourage you to stay engaged and keep your video on if at all possible. You can also include your name and class year. You can rename yourself, and you can do that by clicking on your name or clicking on the buttons on the top three buttons. Oh goodness, it's just been a long weekend already. Clicking on the top of your screen, there are three dots that you can change your name. And then if you have any questions, just feel free to chat and we'll answer them as we go along. All right, Fran, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dana. And thanks everyone for joining. Certainly, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging has been a top priority all this year. And it has been a privilege and honor to partner with Tony Cross, who is our new diversity, equity, and our dean, our director of diversity, equity, and student life. And you know, it's funny, I find that DEIB, which is what we kind of call it it's more than a 3-letter acronym, it's a 4-letter acronym. But those 4 words really are important. Each one of them represents a piece of our mission and action in this area. You know, obviously diversity, we want diversity of points of view, of varied life experiences. We want that inclusivity, people to feel like this is their home. We want equity in how we, execute policy and practices. And, and equally important, we want HB to be a place of belonging where everybody, no matter where they've come from, feels like they belong, where they see themselves and feel their authentic self valued here. And there's been a lot of dynamic conversation around this and a lot of areas to grow and to learning for life. Certainly this is an area that highlights that. And I'm grateful to Tony and her leadership, to our DEIB liaisons, to the Board of Trustees, because certainly this is a priority that they too are leaning into and learning from, and a part of the discussions, a part of our roadmap that has really made progress in some areas. So I'm really thankful, Tony, to you and for all you do, and how you've inspired the girls too. So I'm going to hand this over to you. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you, Dana. And thank you to the board for supporting this work and for all the good stuff that's been happening this year. And if you saw me with angry eyebrows just 5 seconds ago, everyone belongs in this space except for my son right now, who wanted into the room right at the moment that Fran was speaking. So we will just keep it focused here and welcome you to the space and talk a little bit more about affinity groups, give you some background, some history there. You'll need your phone at certain points during this conversation. So make sure that phone is somewhere near you, for you how you use that as we move through the conversation. So again, I'm the Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Student Life at HB. I'm a woman with many hats, and so I'm the Director of the DEI efforts that are happening at HB, and I lead those efforts along with the rest of the faculty staff, but definitely not without my liaison team, which is just amazing women. And then also I am the Dean of Students, so that is such an interesting overlap of conversations, because it really just is about building a community of belonging, right? And how do I make sure that every student feels like this is that space for them? And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So first, let's start with some definitions. And here we go. The term affinity group is used to describe the coming together of people who have an identifier in common and who share a common goal or interest. I'll share some definitions of this in just a slide or so you'll be able to see that. Affinity groups are for individuals who identify as members of the group and can speak to the experience of being a member of that group from the I perspective. So when people talk about, is this the group for me? Should I be here? If you can speak to the experiences of that group or interests of that group from your I perspective, then yes, that's definitely a space for you. In addition to racial or ethnic background or gender-based affinity groups, there are also affinity groups that bring together people based on country of origin or religion or physical ability or any of those big 8 identifiers or any of the other minor identifiers that exist within our spaces and lives. So usually that's the first question that people start with in this conversation is, what is an affinity group? I don't know what that means. What does that look like? And then the next piece of information is usually when people are kind of like surprised and they're like, I didn't realize that there were so many affinity groups that already exist in the spaces that I inhabit. So we'll get into that in just a second. I wanted to give you a little bit of a sneak into the affinity group spaces that currently exist here at HB. In the upper school, we have the Muslim Student Association, we have the Latin Affinity Group, we have the Israeli Club, we have SWAG, Spectrum, Black Cultural Awareness, Asian Affinity Group, and Crossroads is our Christian-based affinity group. In the middle school, we have Pride, which is our what our term is for our middle school spectrum leaders. MSBCA, again, middle school Black Cultural Awareness, MS Asian Affinity Group, the Spanish Latina Group, and then in the Prime, we're going to form our first groups in the 2021-2022 school year under the guidance of Elena McCourt. And so we're really excited about extending this into the prime spaces, although we've already had some overlap in the prime spaces before, specifically with our Muslim students and with our Black students. We brought them together in a big sister, little sister like fashion. And so that's been something that's been going on for some time. And these groups have been around for 5, 6, or 7 years. And groups at HB start because students want them to start. And so I don't start a group for a student. I just introduce the idea of what an identity is to the students, and I give them ideas of what groups could exist, and then they have to approach me and say, Ms. Cross, or they approach the liaisons and say, hey, we want to start a group for these folks. And then we say, yeah, well, let's make it happen.
Tony?
Yes.
Could you share what is SWAG, just to...
The Student-Wide Activist Group. So that's our group of students that identify from the I perspective as folks who see themselves as social justice leaders, folks who really want to engage in conversations around equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging, but they want to do it, like I said, in a really inclusive way. So it's usually educative and presenting forums and conversations and whatnot. Great question. And then Dana, let me know if there are any more questions because I'm not necessarily watching the chat. So here are some ideas of what some affinity groups could look like. You might have even been a member of some of these affinity groups at certain times because, like, based on your identifier. So the first one that we're all sort of a part of is when we're in school, you're with your age group, right? And that group is known as like the 10th grade or the 9th grade or the 8th grade or the sophomores or the seniors, right? That's an affinity space because everyone there can identify from the I perspective of belonging in that group because of their age. Perhaps you're looking at your fraternity or sorority. That's an affinity space as well. Some of the groups I mentioned in the past, the Asian Affinity Group, BCA. BCA is one of our longest standing affinity groups on campus at HB, I believe going over 40 years being at HB. Maybe students from the West Side might want to form an affinity group and saying that we have a certain I perspective and a certain experience because we live on the west side of Cleveland, right? And so we have, transportation woes that we have to tend to on the day-to-day basis because we're commuting. And so that might be a group that we would form there as well. The Shaker Heights Country Club would be considered an affinity group. Again, a space that people can speak from that I perspective and say, I am here because, right? The tennis team. So I just want you to sort of see that we've already existed in affinity spaces, and that you can form affinity spaces based on certain identifiers that you feel could benefit from being in such a space. So why do they exist? They affirm and cultivate identity. Usually you want to have affinity spaces for folks who are one of only or one of few, or are the minorities in a given space. And this helps to affirm who they are, because usually that means that they've experienced sometimes feel isolated or exist in a space that others might not identify with them the same way that someone who can speak to their eye perspective could identify with that thing. So they actually affirm individuals on a very foundational level. They provide space to gather and for students to be in their authentic selves. And so they provide a space for students to come together and to say, wow, I've been having like a really crummy day around this. And others to say, yeah, me too. Or for folks to come together and say, I really enjoyed that we had that speaker. Did you hear what they had to say? And others can say, yeah, I know, I was right there with it too. It just gives that space for students to gather and just to sort of see each other and see each other reflected in each other, and see themselves mirrored. They foster a sense of belonging. That's really the big thing about affinity groups, is that when you have one of only and one of few and you have affinity spaces, it makes it so that those folks, when they go into the wider community, they're actually able to be more vibrant community members, because those little things about themselves that make them unique, they can now celebrate and they're not ashamed of. And that's the beauty of affinity spaces. They also empower members to engage with that wider community, because they give that sense of belonging. They give that sense of you're okay and you are who you are and we value you here. I think affinity groups are just as important for the individuals who are in the group as for those who are not in the group. For folks not in the group to be able to say, yeah, those folks are in an affinity space together, and I totally support that, and I understand why that exists for them, and that perhaps for me, I don't need something that's just like that. And that's okay, because we're a community of diverse folks, and that's totally fine. So these are that we've actually overheard at HB over the past years that I've been there, and that I've served not just as in this role as a director, but as a liaison, and other liaisons have reported that they've heard some of these things being said throughout the school. Are you black? Are you white? What are you anyway? That might have been said to a biracial student. Geez, I'm feeling dyslexic today. That might have been said to a student who had some neurodiversity, and that might have really hurt their. You must be so overwhelmed being a single mom. I don't know how you do it. That would be a perfect moment for single moms to come together and just say, that really felt like a microaggression. That didn't feel so great. Did you get that shirt from Walmart? Again, talking about class, and even having like a class-based affinity group could make or shape a space of belonging for our students. Just all these little comments that happen. And maybe the comments aren't said with the intent to hurt, but that impact is still there. That still happens. And comments don't always have to be negative, and moments don't have to always be negative to lead students to want to be in an affinity space. Perhaps it could just be part of the curriculum, and you hit that moment in curriculum when you're teaching hard history. I love teaching hard history. You're talking about the stuff that shaped who we are, that sometimes is a little traumatic. But of course, you want to balance that with joy. But in those moments of trauma, and those moments where we're reflecting back over something, students can have that moment too in the class, especially if they're one of only or one of few. And so this phrase was actually said by a second grader, not HB, but mentioned in the article that I would like for you to scan. And so you could read a little bit more about this foundational text around affinity groups. So here's what I would like you to do. If you have a Apple, you should just be able to aim it right at the QR code like you're taking a picture, and then it should just pop right on up for you. If you have an Android, you should be able to swipe all the way down, and then you should be able to scan QR code, which is a little button down here. And then if I aim it, I should see that pop up. And you should be taken to this article. So hopefully that worked for you.
I will also put a link to the article in the chat momentarily.
Nice. I'm going to play a little bit with technology here, have a little bit of fun. This article is an oldie but goodie. It's one of those articles that I've been sending to families and other members of our community since we started Affinity groups on campus. It's one of the most critical texts in talking about affinity groups and why they exist. And so I wanted to share this with you because I like to empower people with information. And I know that if you reference an article like this to someone who is doing this work, they're definitely going to say, oh, yeah, I know about that article, right? It's one of just those critical texts. And so hopefully you're able to get that. And if not, it's going to be in the chat. You're going to have another chance to try it again. This is what an affinity space could look like. And so if you scan the article over there that's up in the corner, you'll be taken to another article from NIAS around how affinity groups have saved this woman's life when she talks about her work in schools like ours. And so I believe this is a meeting of the Black moms at the school that she featured in the article. And this picture just feels like a picture of belonging. This is how I want all of our parents to feel when they gather in spaces at HB. And so this picture just feels so good. It's a goal for me, where I want every single family to feel just like this. And I think brunch does that to people anyways. But, having spaces like that for folks. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a chance to scan that article as well. And again, I'll scan it just so I can make sure I have the article title for you. And that's what it's called. How Racial Affinity Groups Saved My Life. Okay. We'll continue. And now we want to talk about cultivating alumni affinity spaces, because that's actually where we're going next with this. So potential affinity spaces that could exist with our HB alum, and that means you. You could make an ethnicity-based affinity group. You could make a geographic region-based affinity, maybe for alums who are in the Midwest versus alums who are on the West Coast versus alums who are in the Deep South versus alums who are in the New England area. Maybe you want to gather with other alums and just make sure you're staying in contact with each other. Perhaps you want to gather a group of folks who are leaning into the work of belonging around you. You want to be in conversations with folks like that. You want to develop your personal learning network with people who are reading books such as Cast, or We Want to Do More Than Survive, or Culturally Responsive Teaching by Zaretta Hammond. And you just want to talk to folks who are like leaning into this stuff. And so that would be a great way to start a group, is to say, hey, I want to start a group of folks who are doing this kind of work. We've had alumni of color in the past, and that group has existed here at HB before. And I believe, Dana, did you want to say a little bit more about that before I moved on?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony. So once somebody asked the question in the chat, or there was a comment about BCA. So BCA is the Black Cultural Awareness Club, and that club actually started in 1974. So it's 47 years old this year. So that is probably one of the longest standing, consistently standing affinity group spaces on campus. And the Alumni of Color group itself is a group that started in 2004. So that was the first meeting in the summer. And there are a few of us on the line who basically talked to the alumni director at the time, who was supportive of our efforts to try and gather alums from that affinity space together. And so there were a number of successes that the group had. Then they had held meet and greets with students. They had a gathering of friends with other CCIS schools during Alumni Weekend. There were some meetings with seniors. Alums participated in panels with the students on campus. And then when we had the listening and learning sessions over the past summer, I guess it was a year, or just about a year ago now, there was an increased excitement about kind of relaunching and re-engaging that group. And we're really excited about that. We are grateful to the alums who reached out to us to offer the support and assistance to get that group back up and going. And we also had board members. We had Cassandra Johnson, Michelle Rogers, we had Heads Council members, and then our Alumni Council, who all joined in and said, hey, what can we do to get this group relaunched and re-engaged, as well as an alum, Cassie Pittman, who actually did some study and research and published a book on retail racism. And so she has reached out to try and get us re-engaged and to see how can we rebuild this group in an era where it's needed and provide the support and engagement that folks are looking for.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that background about the Alumni of Color. And all we want to hear from you and give you all space to talk a little bit more about this idea and breakout rooms that we're going to dismiss you to in just, but I want to give you a little bit more information around what you should be doing in those breakout rooms over those 10 minutes that we'll give you. And so the first thing we would like you to do is to reflect on your time here at HB. This can take up as much time as you want it to, but while you're reflecting on your time at HB, can you think of moments where you maybe were aware that there were affinity groups who were around you? Were you a member of an affinity group or an affinity space? How did that make you feel? How did that impact your experience at HB? Do you maybe wish that you would have had an affinity you could have? Were there spaces that existed that you wish you could have joined and maybe just didn't have the language to join, right? Just thinking through that. You have the space and the graces. Just be yourself and speak from your I perspective there. Did you matriculate in a space where you were one of only or one of few? So when you think about your Big 8 identifiers, were you one of only or one of few in that space? Were you the only Jewish student in the space? Were you the only student from the West Side in that space? Were you the only Black student in that space? Were you the only student who was gender expansive in that space? So take a little bit of time to think about, were you one of only or one of few? And if you weren't, also take some time to think about that and think about, well, wait, maybe I never noticed that. Maybe I never noticed that I was actually in the majority. How might that have felt for me versus feeling for a friend of mine who maybe identified differently? How could alumni affinity groups support re-engagement and help promote a sense of belonging? So that's the third question that we're actually going to send to you in the chat once you go into those breakout spaces, thinking about maybe how could this format promote a sense of belonging and re-engagement for alumni at HB? We've had some great ideas from our Black alumni who are interested in starting a group and thinking through maybe coming and being speakers and hosting webinars. We can still keep the Zoom format in a positive way going forward. So thinking through that idea, what are some ideas that you can maybe generate there? We want to give you some discussion protocols on how to do this because we know that going out into breakout rooms can be a little awkward, but it's only as awkward as you make it. And so where I'm going to say, once you get into your breakout space, we want to start with the person who is wearing red, if anyone is wearing red in your room. And then we're going to progress through the rainbow. So maybe you remember Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. You want to start with the person wearing red, then move on to the person who's wearing orange, and then yellow. So just so that we know who can go next. And we also want to make sure that you're aware of our community norms when you're in these spaces and you're talking to each other. And so I'll go over that very briefly. Be fully present. If you can have your screen on at the time, that'd be lovely. We agree that this is a safe space, but not necessarily a comfortable space. You might be reflecting over stuff that you're like, I never noticed this. I never thought about it through that lens. And I want to make you aware that maybe you'll feel those things, and that's okay. It's okay to feel those feelings. And then you can release them. You all have permission to be imperfect as you're talking and thinking through these conversations. Maybe you don't have the language to say what you want to say, but just try your best, and that's okay. All questions and comments should be made in the spirit of respect. If you're feeling defensive, congratulations, you've stepped outside your comfort zone. Get ready to grow. Focus on shifting behaviors of belief is not really something that's going to apply to these affinity spaces. We use these community norms through our HB, so I'll highlight the ones that might pop up for you in the next 10 minutes. Use I statements. You are responsible for self. So speaking through into your own experience. Be crisp. Say what's core and essential. Make sure you're leaving space for others, especially if you're a big voice, as I like to say, and you like to speak a lot. Leave space for those who are maybe a little quieter or who maybe need processing time before they speak. Be okay with unfinished business. You might have some great thoughts generated while you're in this group, and it's okay if it's not fully fleshed out and formed. You want to just start nurturing those ideas right now. Be comfortable with silence, and then treat the candidness of others as a gift and honor confidentiality. What's said in the group should stay in the group unless you have permission from that person who shared a story to maybe share their story somewhere else. The wisdom that is shared there is for you and the folks who are in that space. So with those community norms shared, and again with the three questions that we have here: reflect on your time at HB. Were you one of only or one of few? Yes or no? How did it feel? And then the main question is, how could alumni affinity groups support re-engagement and help promote a sense of belonging, either for yourself or for someone else to maybe start an alumni affinity group? So those are your three questions. Those are your norms. And now we would like to actually have you go ahead and break out and join breakout rooms based on your identifiers. So Dana, I'm going to stop my share here so that we can see each other. So if you're interested in forming an affinity group space, and maybe it won't be a race-based one, I know that some of you are already asking questions around like, can we have more gender-based identity groups here for our alumni? Definitely, definitely that's a thing. Here's how Dana and I would like to partner to support you. We'll help you with coordinating your meetings and getting your meetings all set up with folks who might be able to identify from that I perspective who might want to engage and network with you in those affinity spaces. You're going to get ongoing communication from us here at HB. We want to give you the resources that you need to make sure that space thrives and flourishes. We'll offer some model-based coaching on the creation of affinity spaces based on how we've gotten our affinity spaces currently at HB to thrive and continue to grow and continue to be inclusive, and some of the evolutions that we've seen with those spaces. And so we'll give you some of that. And we'll also look at some peer schools and their spaces and see how they've been able to run affinity groups so that you can figure out for this group what works best for you all. Opportunity to connect with current HB students and affinity groups that are there. So if you are forming an affinity group that has a connection on campus, like you want to maybe form a spectrum-based affinity group for HB alumni, we would love for you to connect with our Pride group in the middle school, our spectrum group in the upper school when they're doing movie nights, or when they're engaged in the Day of Silence, or when they're trying to educate the students about LGBTQ plus History Month. If that's something that you'd like to lean into, we'd like for you to connect with current students at HB, because it's nothing more powerful than for an adolescent or a young person to see someone who, has made it, right, as an adult, and see that they're thriving and that they're surviving and they're flourishing, and it's just all that good stuff. And so we'd love to put you in contact with each other. And then lastly, we want to promote and recognize efforts throughout the HB community. We want to let others know that you're doing the good work too, and you're doing it right along with us. So we'd love to share anything that you're willing for us to share with the greater HB community, because again, we are forming our family. We're making our family here at HB. And so that takes effort, that takes dedication, it takes building. And so that's what we're willing to do. If this is something that is intriguing to you, all you have to do is say the word. Okay?
And please visit the hb.edu/diversity for more information, and reach out to Tony and to me, and enjoy the rest of your day. And don't forget to look at all of the other links for Alumni Weekend. Thank you for making our first virtual Alumni Weekend a success. Hopefully our last virtual Alumni Weekend, but we will have virtual components of future Alumni Weekends. So we look forward to seeing you all on campus as soon as we're able to gather.